This video is made for entertainment purposes only. I never believed in Bigfoot. Not once in my 53 years on this earth did I think those grainy photographs and campfire stories held any truth. I was a practical man, a cattle rancher in the Cascade foothills of Washington state, where the work was hard, the winters were brutal, and superstition had no place beside diesel engines and veterinary bills. But that changed one frozen February morning when I found myself staring into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist. My name is Tom Hargrove, and this is the story of how everything I thought I knew about the world shattered in a single moment of terrible clarity. It started 3 months earlier, in late November, just after the first serious snowfall. I'd been losing cattle. Not to disease, not to predators I recognized, something else. Something that left tracks I couldn't identify and took my livestock with an efficiency that chilled me more than the mountain wind. The first loss was a young heifer, maybe 8 months old. I found her missing from the eastern pasture on a Tuesday morning, and at first, I figured she'd just wandered off through a gap in the fence. Cattle do that sometimes, especially the younger ones. But when I rode out to check the fence line, everything was intact. No broken posts, no trampled wire. Just gone. I spent 2 days searching the tree line and the lower slopes. Nothing. Not a trace. It was like she'd simply vanished into the morning mist. Then it happened again. And again. By mid-January, I'd lost 6 head of cattle, 3 calves, 2 heifers, and one of my breeding bulls. That last one hurt. He was a fine Angus, worth more than my truck, and strong as an ox. Whatever took him had to be powerful beyond measure. The tracks I found told a story I didn't want to believe. They were massive, nearly twice the size of a man's boot print, and they showed a bipedal gait. The stride length was enormous, sometimes 6 or 7 feet between prints. In the soft snow near the tree line, I could see the distinct impression of 5 toes, the big toe offset like a thumb. The depth of the prints suggested incredible weight, far more than any bear. I told myself it had to be a bear. Grizzlies can walk upright sometimes, can't they? But these tracks never went down to all fours. Not once. And bears don't hunt cattle with this kind of precision. I called Fish and Wildlife. They sent out a young officer named Reeves who looked at the tracks, took some photographs, and told me it was probably a large black bear, maybe displaced by the early snow. He suggested I bring my cattle in closer to the ranch buildings at night and maybe invest in some electric fencing. I did both. It didn't help. The predation continued through January. 2 more calves disappeared, and I started losing sleep. The financial burden was crushing. Each lost animal represented months of feed, care, and investment, but it was more than that. There was something deeply unsettling about the whole situation. The methodical nature of it. The intelligence. Because that's what bothered me most. This wasn't random predation. Whatever was taking my cattle was selecting them carefully, avoiding the areas near my house and barn where I kept lights burning all night. It was learning my patterns, adapting to my defenses. My neighbors started talking. Word spreads fast in rural communities, and soon everyone within 20 miles knew about Tom Hargrove's mystery predator. Some of the older ranchers shared their own stories. Strange encounters in the deep woods, sounds that didn't belong, shapes moving through the trees at dusk that were too large and too upright to be any animal they recognized. One evening in late January, my neighbor Carl Whitmore came by with a bottle of whiskey and a serious expression. Carl was 72, a third-generation rancher who'd seen everything these mountains could throw at a man. "You know what's taking your cattle," he said, pouring us both 3 fingers of bourbon. It wasn't a question. Carl, don't. My grandfather saw one. Summer of 1943. Up in the high timber near Cascade Pass. He didn't talk about it much, but before he died, he told me the whole story. Said it was 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur, with eyes that looked human. Too human. It watched him for maybe 5 minutes from across a clearing, then just melted back into the forest. He never went back to that area. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to laugh and change the subject. But I couldn't, because some part of me, some deep, instinctual part, already knew the truth. What did he think it was? I asked quietly. Carl met my eyes over his whiskey glass. He called it by the old Salish word. Sesksi. The wild man of the woods. What folks nowadays call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. He paused. But Tom, he didn't think of it as some dumb animal. He said you could see intelligence in those eyes. Understanding. Maybe even sadness. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind howl outside. So what do? I finally asked. Carl shrugged. Protect what's yours. That's all any man can do. The next day, I ordered the bear trap. It was a massive piece of equipment, a Bridger No. 6 offset jaw trap with a heavy-duty spring system designed for grizzly bears. The jaws had rubber padding to minimize injury, and the whole thing was anchored with a chain capable of holding several hundred pounds. I wasn't trying to kill whatever was out there. I just wanted answers. I wanted to see what I was dealing with. I set it up in the eastern pasture near where the tracks were most concentrated, using one of my older steers as bait. I secured the steer with a long tether that gave him plenty of room to graze but kept him in the general vicinity of the trap. Then I concealed the trap itself under a thin layer of snow and pine needles, positioning it along what I'd identified as the creature's primary approach route. I felt sick doing it. Some deep part of me whispered that this was wrong, that I was crossing a line I didn't fully understand. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I was a rancher defending my livelihood. I had every right. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The steer grazed peacefully, and the trap remained undisturbed. I began to think maybe the predation had stopped, that whatever had been taking my cattle had moved on to easier hunting grounds. Then came the 4th night. I woke just before dawn to a sound I'll never forget, a scream that wasn't quite human but wasn't animal either. It was a cry of pain and rage and something else. Something that sounded horribly like despair. I grabbed my rifle and my flashlight and ran toward the eastern pasture, my boots crunching through the crusty snow. The temperature had dropped below 0 overnight, and my breath came out in great white clouds. The scream came again, weaker this time, and I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. When I crested the small rise that overlooked the pasture, my flashlight beam found it. The trap had worked. What I saw in that moment defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Caught in the steel jaws of my bear trap was a creature that stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, smaller than I'd expected from the tracks, covered in thick, dark brown fur matted with snow and blood. It was humanoid in shape, with powerful shoulders, long arms, and a pronounced brow ridge over eyes that reflected my flashlight beam with an eerie amber glow. A juvenile. It had to be. That explained the smaller size, the perhaps less cautious approach. It was struggling against the trap, pulling with desperate strength, but the chain and anchor held firm. The creature's right leg was caught in the jaws, and even with the rubber padding, I could see blood staining the snow around it. I approached slowly, my rifle raised but not aimed directly at it. I wasn't sure what I intended to do. Call Fish and Wildlife? The media? The thought of the chaos that would descend on my ranch if word got out was almost as frightening as the creature itself. As I got closer, the creature stopped struggling and fixed its eyes on me. Those eyes. Carl's grandfather had been right. They were too human. Intelligent and aware in a way that no animal's eyes should be. There was pain in them, certainly, but also something else. Evaluation. Assessment. And then it did something that stopped me cold. It spoke. Not in English, not in any language I recognized. But it was clearly communication. A series of low, complex vocalizations that had the rhythm and structure of speech. The sounds were deep, resonating in a frequency that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. I stood there frozen, my finger on the rifle's safety, completely unprepared for this reality. The creature tried to sign with its hands, gesturing toward the forest, then toward itself, then back toward the trees. The movements were deliberate, almost frantic in their urgency. It was trying to tell me something. I should have been terrified. By all rights, I should have pulled the trigger, ended this impossibility, and buried the evidence deep in the woods where no one would ever find it. That's what the rational part of my brain screamed at me to do. But I couldn't. Because in that moment, looking into those two human eyes, I didn't see a monster or a threat. I saw a person. Different, yes. Impossible, certainly. But undeniably a person, someone's child, caught and hurt and desperate. My hands began to shake. The rifle barrel dipped toward the snow. And that's when I heard it. Another vocalization from the tree line, deeper and more powerful than the juvenile's cries. The sound carried across the pasture with an authority that made my bones vibrate. The juvenile responded immediately, its voice rising in pitch, almost pleading. I turned my flashlight toward the forest edge, and the beam caught a shape that made my blood turn to ice. Another one. Much larger. Easily 8 feet tall, with massive shoulders and arms that seemed longer than they should be. It stood just at the edge of the tree line, partially concealed by the shadows but clearly visible in the pale pre-dawn light that was beginning to break over the mountains. This was the adult. This was what had been taking my cattle. The large creature didn't charge. It didn't roar or threaten. It just stood there, and somehow that was more terrifying than any aggressive display could have been. There was a terrible patience in its stillness, a kind of expectant waiting that made me understand with perfect clarity that my next decision would determine whether I lived or died. The juvenile cried out again, and this time I understood the emotion in its voice. It wasn't calling for rescue. It was pleading, begging the larger creature not to do what it was clearly prepared to do. My flashlight beam wavered between the two of them. Mother and child. It had to be. The physical similarities were too obvious, and the dynamic between them spoke of a bond one recognized from my own life. I thought of my daughter Sarah, now grown and living in Seattle. I thought of how I would feel if she were trapped and hurt and I was too afraid to help her. Slowly, very slowly, I lowered my rifle. I set it down in the snow, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. Then I raised my empty hands, palms out, in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent. The large creature didn't move, but I felt something shift in its posture. A slight relaxation, perhaps. Or maybe just a recalculation of threat assessment. I turned back to the juvenile and began moving toward the trap, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The creature watched me come, its breathing rapid and shallow, body tensed for pain or attack. When I reached the trap, I knelt down carefully, keeping my movements slow. Up close, I could see the details that my flashlight had missed, the intricate structure of the fur, each hair thick and hollow for insulation. The creature's hands, so much like human hands but larger, with thick calluses on the palms and fingertips. The face, strangely expressive despite the pronounced brow and broad nose. And those eyes, watching me with an intensity that made me feel utterly transparent. "I'm going to help you," I said quietly, knowing the words themselves were meaningless but hoping the tone would convey something. "I'm going to let you go." The trap release mechanism was designed to be operated with gloved hands, and I was grateful for that small mercy as I reached for the heavy spring lever. The juvenile watched my every movement, its breathing coming in quick, shallow gasps that created small clouds in the frigid air. "Easy," I murmured, more to myself than to the creature. "Just stay still. I know it hurts, but I need you to stay still." I positioned myself carefully, bracing my feet in the snow for leverage. The release mechanism required significant pressure. It wasn't meant to be easily opened, that was the whole point, and I wasn't sure I'd be strong enough to compress the spring one-handed while holding the jaws open. The juvenile made a soft sound, and when I glanced at its face, I saw something that nearly broke me. Its eyes were wet. Not just from pain or cold, but with actual tears tracking through the fur on its cheeks. It was crying. That simple, undeniable fact shattered the last of my resistance. Whatever this creature was, Sasquatch, Sasquatch, wild man, it could cry. It could feel emotional pain distinct from physical suffering. How could I possibly consider it an animal after seeing that? "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry I did this to you." I pressed down hard on the release lever, feeling the powerful spring resist my weight. The juvenile tensed, anticipating more pain, but I kept steady pressure until I felt the mechanism begin to give. With my other hand, I carefully spread the jaws, trying to minimize the movement of the rubber-padded steel against the injured leg. The juvenile let out a sharp breath as the pressure released, and for a moment I thought it might strike me. Those powerful arms could easily crush my skull, but it remained still, trembling but controlled. As soon as the jaws were fully open, The creature pulled its leg free with surprising gentleness, as if it understood that sudden movement would only cause more pain. I stepped back quickly, giving it space, and watched as it examined the injury. The leg was badly bruised and lacerated where the rubber padding had worn thin, but miraculously, nothing appeared to be broken. The juvenile looked at me then, and I saw something pass across its face. Not gratitude, exactly, that would be too simple, too human a concept to project. But recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement that I had made a choice and that choice had meaning. It tried to stand and nearly fell. The injured leg wouldn't bear its full weight yet. I instinctively reached out to help, then thought better of it and pulled my hand back. The creature saw the gesture, though, and something shifted in its expression. A sound from the tree line drew both our attention. The larger creature, the mother, had moved closer. Not threateningly, but with clear purpose. She stood perhaps 30 yards away now, fully visible in the growing dawn light, and I could see her more clearly than before. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Easily 8 feet tall, maybe 8.5, with a barrel chest and shoulders that spoke of tremendous strength. Her fur was a darker brown than the juvenile's, almost black in places, silvered at the temples and around the muzzle in a way that suggested age and experience. Her face held an expression I couldn't quite read, wariness certainly, but also something that looked disturbingly like calculation. The juvenile called out to her, voice high and rapid, and she responded with a series of deep vocalizations that seemed to echo across the pasture. They were communicating. There was no question about it. This wasn't simple animal signaling. This was language, complex, nuanced, and purposeful. The juvenile began to move toward the tree line, limping badly but making progress. I watched it go, still kneeling in the bloody snow beside the trap, my mind struggling to process what was happening. The mother watched me as her offspring approached. I could feel the weight of her gaze even from this distance, the terrible intelligence behind those eyes evaluating me in ways I couldn't begin to understand. When the juvenile reached her, she did something I'll never forget. She reached out with one massive hand and gently touched the top of its head, then ran her fingers through the fur on its shoulders, a gesture of comfort and relief that was heartbreakingly familiar. Every parent who has ever been reunited with an injured child would recognize that touch. Then she looked at me again, and I understood with absolute certainty that she was making a choice just as I had made mine. She raised one hand slowly, palm out, in what looked like a deliberate mirror of my earlier gesture. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the snow-covered pasture. Two parents, two protectors, acknowledging some unspoken understanding that transcended species. Then she turned and led her offspring into the forest, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Within seconds, they had disappeared into the shadows beneath the pines, leaving nothing but tracks in the snow and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I don't know how long I knelt there in the cold. Long enough for the sun to fully rise over the eastern ridge, painting the snow gold and amber. Long enough for my knees to go numb and my hands to start aching from the cold. Long enough to understand that my entire worldview had just been demolished and rebuilt in the span of 30 minutes. When I finally stood, my legs were shaking. I looked down at the trap, at the blood staining the steel and snow, and felt a wave of shame so intense it made me nauseous. I had done this. I had caused pain to something that could cry, something that could love and be loved by its mother. I gathered up my rifle, though it felt strange in my hands now, like a relic from some previous life, and walked slowly back toward the house. The eastern sky was bright now, streaked with high clouds that promised more snow by evening. My cattle were stirring in the near pasture, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before, but nothing was the same. I spent that day in a fog, going through the motions of ranch work while my mind spun in circles. I kept replaying the encounter, examining it from every angle, trying to understand what it meant. The tears. The mother's deliberate gesture. The obvious love between them. Every detail reinforced the same impossible conclusion. They were people. Not human, certainly, but people nonetheless. Intelligent. Emotional. Capable of communication and abstract thought. Living in the deep woods of the Cascades, surviving in conditions that would kill a human, existing in parallel with us but hidden. Always hidden. How many were there? How long had they been here? And perhaps most importantly, what were they facing that had driven them to the desperate measure of hunting cattle? That last question haunted me because I thought I knew the answer. The juvenile had been thin. Not starving, but lean in a way that spoke of sustained hunger. And the mother, for all her impressive size and strength, had moved with a slight hesitation that suggested she wasn't at full strength either. They were hungry. Their traditional food sources must be declining, disrupted by the changing climate or human encroachment or both. The cattle predation wasn't malice or mindless animal behavior. It was desperation. Survival. I thought about that while I fed my own herd that evening, watching them eat the supplemental hay I'd put out. I had resources. I had options. If feed got scarce, I could buy more. If the weather got bad, I could move animals to shelter. But what options did these creatures have? They were bound to this land, this ecosystem, with nowhere else to go. That night, I made a decision. Instead of bringing all my cattle in close, I left 2 of my older steers in the eastern pasture. They were good animals, but past their breeding prime, worth more to me as beef than as breeders. I told myself I was just being practical, reducing potential losses by offering acceptable sacrifices. But it was more than that, and I knew it. This was my apology. My acknowledgement that I shared this land with others who had just as much right to survive as I did. 3 days later, one of the steers was gone. Taken cleanly in the night, probably killed quickly given the lack of blood or signs of struggle. The tracks in the new snow were massive and familiar, the mother returning alone. She took one animal every 10 to 12 days after that. Always one of the steers I left in the eastern pasture. Never more than she needed. Never attacking the animals closer to my buildings. It was almost like a deal, an arrangement between neighbors. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. How could I explain it? Tom Hargrove, feeding Bigfoot from his personal herd like some kind of deranged wildlife enthusiast. The whole community would think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But I didn't think so. For the first time in months, I was sleeping through the night. The predation had a pattern now, predictable and manageable. And more than that, I felt like I'd made a choice that honored something important. Something about coexistence and compassion that went beyond simple logic. February turned to March, and the snow began to melt. I caught glimpses of tracks sometimes in the remaining patches of white, usually at dawn or dusk. Once, I saw a shape moving through the trees on the high ridge above my property, tall and upright, pausing for a moment to look down at the ranch before continuing on. I waved. I don't know why. It seemed like the right thing to do. March turned to April, and the high country began to green up. The steers in the eastern pasture continued to disappear on schedule. My breeding cattle remained untouched. Some of my neighbors commented on how lucky I was that my predator problem had resolved itself. I just nodded and changed the subject. Then, one morning in mid-April, I woke to find something new. I developed a habit of checking the eastern pasture first thing each morning, walking out with my coffee to see if there had been any nighttime activity. This particular morning was cool and clear, the sky that pale blue. That promises a perfect spring day. As I approached the pasture fence, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Arranged on the top rail of the fence, carefully placed, were 3 objects. A deer antler, still attached to a portion of skull. A large, perfect pine cone from a sugar pine. And a chunk of honeycomb, the wax still glistening with honey in the morning light. Gifts. I stood there staring at them, my coffee growing cold in my hand, trying to process what this meant. They had value, the antler for its calcium and minerals, the pine cone for its seeds, the honeycomb for its concentrated energy. These weren't trash or random forest debris. These were offerings. Payment for the cattle? A thank you. An acknowledgement of our arrangement? I reached out with a shaking hand and touched the honeycomb gently. It was fresh, probably left sometime during the night. The gesture it represented was so profoundly human, this concept of reciprocity, of exchange, of gratitude, that I felt tears burning in my eyes. "You're welcome," I whispered to the empty pasture. "You're welcome." I brought the gifts inside and placed them on my mantel, where they still sit today. The antler and pine cone remain intact. The honeycomb is long gone. I couldn't bring myself to keep it after it began to attract ants, but I remember exactly how it tasted. Wild and complex, nothing like the store-bought honey from the supermarket. It tasted like the deep forest, like secrets and survival. The arrangement continued through spring and into summer. One steer every week and a half or so. Occasional gifts left on the fence. Interesting rocks, bird feathers, once a perfectly preserved fossil of something ancient and strange. I found myself looking forward to checking the fence each morning, wondering what I might find. In late June, something changed. I was mending fence in the northern section of my property when I heard a sound that didn't belong. Voices, but not quite. Those deep vocalizations I'd heard months before, but multiple sources now, and some of them higher pitched. Younger. I followed the sound carefully, moving slowly through the timber until I could see down into a small meadow on the boundary between my land and the national forest. What I saw there has stayed with me every single day since. There were 4 of them. The mother I recognized immediately, her size and coloring unmistakable. The juvenile I'd caught in the trap, now looking healthier and more filled out, though still moving with a slight limp. And 2 others, smaller than the juvenile, perhaps 4 feet tall, with lighter brown fur and the proportions of young children. More offspring. Younger siblings. They were playing. There's no other word for it. The 2 small ones were wrestling in the grass, tumbling over each other with obvious joy while making high-pitched sounds that could only be described as laughter. The juvenile sat nearby, watching them with what looked like tolerant amusement, occasionally reaching out to steady one when they tumbled too close. And the mother sat slightly apart, her back against a massive Douglas fir, watching over all of them with an expression of contentment that transcended species. She looked tired. Caring for 3 offspring alone must have been exhausting, but there was peace in her posture. I watched them for nearly an hour, barely breathing, afraid any movement would break the spell. This was their life. Their family. They loved and laughed and cared for each other just as humans did. They had social structures, parenting instincts, play behavior. Everything about them spoke of complex emotional lives and sophisticated intelligence. The mother knew I was there. I realized that after about 20 minutes, when her gaze swept over my hiding spot without apparent concern. She'd allowed this. She'd chosen to let me see this moment, to witness her family in their private sanctuary. It was a gift more valuable than any antler or honeycomb. As I watched, the juvenile began teaching the younger one something, a demonstration of hand movements that looked almost like sign language, repeated patiently until the little ones could mirror the gestures. Language instruction. Active teaching. Another marker of high intelligence that set them apart from even the most sophisticated animals. When the sun began to sink toward the western ridges, the mother stood and made a series of low vocalizations. The young ones stopped playing immediately, responding to her call with the instant obedience of children who know better than to argue. The juvenile helped gather them, gently herding them toward the deeper forest. Before they left the meadow, the mother turned back toward my position. She looked directly at me, no pretense now, just open acknowledgement. Then she raised one hand, palm out, holding it there for a long moment before turning and following her family into the shadows. I stood up from my concealment and returned the gesture, though they were already gone. My face was wet with tears. I hadn't realized I was crying. Tears for the beauty of what I'd witnessed. Tears for the terrible responsibility I now carried. And tears for the impossible situation these remarkable beings found themselves in, trying to survive in a world that was shrinking around them, where humans claimed more territory every year and their traditional hunting grounds became housing developments and ski resorts. That night, I broke my silence. I called Carl Whitmore and asked him to come over. When he arrived, I poured us both generous amounts of whiskey and told him everything. Every detail, from the trap to the tears to the gifts to the family I'd watched in the meadow. Carl listened without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable in the lamplight. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You believe me," I said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Course I do. I told you my grandfather saw one. But Tom, this is bigger than that. You're not just talking about sightings. You're talking about sustained contact. About," he paused, searching for the right word, Diplomacy, almost, between species. I don't know what to do, I admitted. They're struggling, Carl. The mother is trying to feed 3 offspring alone. There's no sign of a father. Maybe he's dead, or maybe their social structure is different than ours. But whatever the reason, she's desperate enough to risk coming onto my land repeatedly. And if she's desperate, how many others are out there in the same situation? Carl swirled his whiskey thoughtfully. You can't save them all, Tom. You know that. I know. But I can help these 4. And maybe I can do more. Maybe I can buy some of that timber lot adjacent to my property, the one that's been for sale for 2 years. It borders the national forest. If I own it, I can keep it undeveloped. Give them safe passage, protected territory. That's 160 acres. You got that kind of money. I didn't. But my brother in Portland did well in commercial real estate, and he owed me a favor from years back when I'd helped him through a rough divorce. I made the call the next morning. By mid-July, the property was mine, or rather, ours. Mine and my brother's, held in a trust that specified it could never be developed for commercial purposes. 160 acres of old-growth timber and mountain meadows, connecting my ranch to thousands of acres of protected national forest. A corridor. A sanctuary. I didn't see them for several weeks after that, though the cattle predation continued on schedule. And occasional gifts appeared on the fence. I told myself they were just being cautious, that the presence of surveyors and lawyers during the property transfer had made them wary. But in late August, on a clear evening with the mountain peaks painted orange by the setting sun, I found all 4 of them waiting for me in the eastern pasture. They stood at the edge of the tree line, clearly visible, making no attempt to hide. The mother in front, the juvenile to her right, the 2 smaller ones pressed close to her legs. They watched me approach from my porch, their stillness somehow more communicative than any gesture. I walked out to meet them, slowly and without the rifle I used to carry everywhere. When I was perhaps 20 yards away, the mother raised her hand, that gesture we'd shared before. I returned it. Then she did something extraordinary. She placed her hand on the juvenile's shoulder and gently pushed forward. The juvenile limped toward me, clearly nervous, stopping about 10 feet away. Up close, I could see the scars on its leg where the trap had injured it months before. Permanent reminders of my fear and ignorance. The juvenile made a series of vocalizations, then gestured toward the new timber property, then back toward me. The meaning was clear enough. They knew. They understood that the land was now protected, that it was connected to my property, that I had done this deliberately. Yes, I said softly. It's for you. For your family. It's safe. I don't know how much of the words it understood, probably none, but the tone seemed to convey something. The juvenile's posture relaxed slightly. It looked back at its mother, who made a low rumbling sound that might have been encouragement. Then the juvenile reached into the thick fur at its side. I hadn't noticed before, but they seemed to have something like natural pockets where items could be tucked against the skin, and pulled out an object. It stepped forward carefully and placed it on the ground between us, then retreated quickly. I waited until it was back with its family before I approached to see what had been left. When I picked it up, my hands started shaking. It was a carved stone, a piece of basalt, smooth and dark, shaped into something like a bear or perhaps one of their own kind. The carving was crude but deliberate, showing clear evidence of tool use and artistic intent. Representation. Symbolic thinking. Art. I looked up at them, this impossible family, and saw the mother watching my reaction intently. She wanted me to understand. This wasn't just a gift. This was proof. Proof of everything she was, everything her kind represented. A declaration of personhood in the only language we could share. Thank you, I said, my voice breaking. Thank you. I understand. We stood there in the fading light, human and Sasquatch, bridging a gap that shouldn't have been possible to cross. Then, as darkness began to gather beneath the trees, they turned and walked into the forest, not fleeing, just leaving. Moving with the confidence of beings who knew they had a safe place to return to. I stood in the pasture until full dark, the carved stone warm in my hand, understanding with perfect clarity that my life had been divided into before and after. Before I knew they existed. After I learned they were people. The arrangement continues to this day. They take one steer every week or so. They leave gifts on the fence, carvings mostly, each one unique, each one precious beyond measure. I see them occasionally, always at a distance, always with mutual respect. The young ones are growing. The juvenile's limp has almost disappeared. Last month, I saw the mother with another adult, larger than her, darker fur, moving with protective wariness. A mate, perhaps, or a brother. Either way, she's no longer alone. That gives me more joy than I can adequately express. I'm 61 now, and my daughter Sarah has started asking about succession planning for the ranch. She wants to know what I intend to do with all this land when I'm gone. Last week, I finally told her the truth. All of it. The trap, the tears, the family, the protected corridor. She thought I'd lost my mind at first. But then I showed her the carvings. I have 17 now, arranged on shelves in my study like the precious artifacts they are. I showed her the records I've kept of their visits, the patterns I've documented. And finally, one evening at dusk, I took her to the eastern pasture and we waited. They came. All of them, including 2 I'd never seen before. 7 Sasquatch, standing at the tree line, visible in the dying light. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only sound as we watched them watch us. The mother raised her hand. I returned the gesture. Sarah, trembling, did the same. When they'd gone, Sarah turned to me with tears streaming down her face. "Dad," she whispered. "Dad, what do we do? How do we protect them?" I pulled her close and looked out at the darkening forest that held more mysteries than I would ever fully understand. "We keep the land," I said. "We keep it safe. And we don't tell anyone who wouldn't understand. That's how we protect them. By giving them space to exist." She nodded against my shoulder. "I understand. I'll continue it. When you're gone, I'll continue it. I know you will." These days, I spend a lot of time thinking about choices. About the moment I could have pulled the trigger but chose mercy instead. About how different everything would be if I'd made the other choice, if I'd given in to fear instead of listening to conscience. I think about all the other ranchers who've had similar encounters, who've seen things they can't explain in the deep woods. How many of them chose differently than I did? How many Sasquatch have been shot and buried in unmarked graves because fear triumphed over compassion? And I think about the future. About climate change and habitat loss and the 1,000 ways humans are making this world less hospitable to beings who want nothing more than to be left alone. How long can they survive? How many are left? I don't have answers. But I have my land, my protected corridor, and a family of remarkable beings who trust me enough to raise their young in sight of my home. That's not nothing. Maybe it's not enough, but it's not nothing. Last week, there was a new carving on the fence. This one showed 2 figures, one clearly meant to be a Sasquatch, the other smaller and more proportional, probably representing me. They were standing side by side, both with hands raised in that gesture of peace and acknowledgement we've shared so many times. Together. That's what it said. Different, but together. Sharing this land, this mountain, this impossible coexistence. I keep that carving in my pocket now, smooth stone wearing smoother from constant handling. On bad days, when I read news about forests being cleared and animals going extinct, I take it out and remember. I remember the juvenile's tears. The mother's fierce love for her children. The laughter of young ones playing in mountain meadows. The artistic soul that carved beauty from stone just to communicate across the unbridgeable gap between species. And I remember the choice I made. The moment I lowered my rifle and decided that compassion mattered more than fear, that coexistence was possible if we were just brave enough to try. That's the story. That's how a practical cattle rancher in the Cascade foothills learned that the world is larger and stranger and more wonderful than he ever imagined. That's how I found family in the most unexpected place, and purpose in protection rather than domination. I'm not asking you to believe me. I know how it sounds. I know what people say about Bigfoot stories. The hoaxes, the misidentifications, the desperate desire to believe in something mysterious. But I also know what I've seen, what I've experienced, What's carved in stone on the shelves in my study. They're real. They're people. And they're worth protecting. That juvenile I caught in my trap? The one whose tears changed everything? I saw it last month, fully grown now, teaching its own offspring to carve patterns in soft pine bark. The cycle continuing. Life persisting despite everything trying to stamp it out. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what would have happened if I'd made the other choice. If I'd given in to fear and ignorance instead of recognizing the person behind the impossible form. That timeline haunts me more than any ghost. A world where that family doesn't exist. Where those carvings were never made. Where the gap between species remained forever unbridged. But that's not the world we live in. We live in this world where sometimes, just sometimes, humans choose compassion over fear. Where coexistence is possible when we're brave enough to see past the surface to the personhood beneath. That's the world I want to believe in. The world I'll keep fighting for, one protected acre at a time, one gift on a fence post, one gesture of peace exchanged between impossible neighbors. That's the world where, on cold February mornings, a rancher can look up at the tree line and see a tall figure watching over the land we share, and feel not fear, but gratitude. Gratitude for the gift of knowing they exist. Gratitude for the trust they've shown. And gratitude for the reminder that this earth is big enough for all of us, if only we choose to make room. The carved stone grows warm in my pocket. The sun rises over the Cascades, painting the snow gold. And somewhere in the protected timber, a family wakes to another day of survival, another day of existing in the hidden spaces humans leave behind. They're still here. Against all odds, despite everything, they're still here. And so am I, standing guard over the land we share, making sure there's still a place for impossible beings in an increasingly small world. That's my choice. That's my purpose. That's the legacy I'll leave to my daughter and whatever comes after. A corridor. A sanctuary. A bridge between worlds. And the simple truth that compassion, once chosen, changes everything.